I'm going to start by selecting a few colors that are closer to the halftone value in temperature, way before I try to think of those lighter lights. Got kind of a neutral orangey kind of red in the halftone around here, and I'm going to start applying that basically the way I've applied everything else, by just kind of gradually going with the form. And it's something I've noticed on a few of your drawings that I think you should look at as soon as you go, after we finish this, as soon as you go back to drawing from the model, ask yourself, do you have the eyes separated out from the shadow? They should be, in this particular setup, the eyes are basically all in shadow. So if you got the eyes kind of outlined and separated from the shadow, you need to clarify that they're in the shadow mix. Like before, I make a few marks, I kind of assess how they relate to the drawing and my subject, and then I go back. I don't just try to start going like that everywhere. So, be careful, methodical, and think through all of your decisions rather than just throwing something down for the sake of throwing it down. One thing I'm also thinking about when I put down these marks is I'm thinking about the pressure I'm putting on the stick, which dictates how much of that gray tone is showing through, which plays a role in the type of value I'm putting down in a certain area. So at first glance it might seem like I'm taking the same color and I'm just throwing it everywhere, but by varying the amount of pressure, the actual value and the temperature of that color will shift, because more or less of the gray undertone shows through. Some areas in the shadow, especially the hair, I can go and start to push down a little bit more. So like I was saying earlier, it's not like I, get to the point where I'm never going to go back into some of the darks. I just try to work them up as much as possible before I start referencing the lights. But as soon as I reference the lights, I could tell, well, there's these areas around the hair that could be pushed down a little bit more, pushed down a little darker. Around here I start to come into the light, and I'm using a kind of neutral yellow, like a yellow ochreish if I had to compare this to an oil painting, but if it shows up that much in the projection, it's not quite as light as one might see. I mean, obviously I look in that area on the cheekbone, I can tell it's a lighter area in general, but like anything else, I'm working up to it. So like right here, I've used the same color I used there, but with much less pressure, which means more of the gray shows through. The thing I'm noticing as I put in this yellow ochre is, in as much as the light mass is warm, if I were to just leave this yellow ochreish color and this kind of neutral orange in, I'm probably going to end up with a light mass that's too warm. So basically in my mind I'm thinking I'm probably going to skim over this to a certain extent later on with a cool color to kind of keep it from being too warm and going too much in an intense direction. And in the handout you'll notice I have a lot of up-close shots of the face because I basically came to the end result for what's happening in the light by stage over stage over stage and adjustment over adjustment. Right here for my like highlights coming in, but I'm not putting in the lightest value version yet. If you look really close around areas such as here and around here on the model, you'll notice that that's where the bone is coming close to the surface. What you'll also notice is a little bit of a subtle cool color in that area in the light mass. Similar in value to what's around it, but slightly different in temperature. Little bit of light coming right about there. Which is an example of how you can draw the lighter lights in later, right in that area. I think here in a second I should get to some of the light around there. But even if I stop right now, like I've said earlier, I can still tell exactly where or how the light is falling on the form. So if you look at your drawing and you can't really tell with clarity where's the light, where's the shadow, that's an indication either you're going too light in the shadow most likely, or you've got the light mass and the shadow mass too close in value to one another. I can tell there's a lighter area here, but the subtle gradation in value as I go towards the edge of that shadow. And also notice I keep bouncing around from area to area. As soon as I start kind of refining some of the things that are happening in the shadow of the hair, I notice there's some areas that need a little more reference in terms of the cool reflecting light. Going in with a slightly lighter pigment right here, but it's still far from being, pure white. Like here's the white one. Maybe it's a little off because of the projection, but this is, you can see, pure white versus this lighter pigment. This is probably the lightest, this one right here is the lightest I would go, but I'm also using very, very minimal pressure when I put it on. Because if I put a lot of pressure down, obviously it's going to go way too light. And the last thing I would ever do in any of the areas in the shadow that are catching reflecting light, I would never work in with a pigment this light. I would go way too light if I did that. I look at this side versus this side, this one is not quite as light as that side. So when I put this lighter pigment in over here, I have to be really careful again about how much pressure I'm putting down. Otherwise I'm going to make both the right and left sides too even. And remember, you're not looking to put everything in there. You're looking to put the most important things, the most dominant, the most noticeable changes. A little bit of a cool reflection into here. A little bit of warmth coming in right about the side of it. Go into part of this with some of the pencils because I have a sharper point, but like I was saying last time, you can sharpen the end of one of the sticks if you need to get a sharp point. I'm working around the edge of the eye, but I'm being really, really careful not to make it too hard, the edge of the eye too hard, because I'm dealing with the shadow, which has a subtle variations in it. This is basically a gray pencil I'm using right now. just a minute, I'm going to reference that light that is on the eyelid. There's a story I read about Sargent. I think I might have mentioned this in class earlier, but where he was doing a portrait commission, and he wrote how the finished version of the portrait you see in the painting he's talking about took him 20 minutes, but it was a painting at the same time that took him 3 weeks. What he meant was, for 3 weeks he would paint it, scrape it off, paint it, scrape it off, paint it, scrape it off, redo it, redo it, redo it. So when I'm putting in this light shape for the eyelid right now, if I find the shape is misplaced, it's not the right value, then I'm going to just kind of take it back out and then readjust it. So in the end, the shape I end up with maybe took me 20 minutes, but it was 20 minutes and then several adjustments. Does that make sense? Reflecting cool coming in here. This is one of the things I'm going to be very nitpicky about in your final project. How clear have you been able to maintain the division of light and dark? Have you overemphasized the features? Have you left them too blurry? See a little bit of the white of the eye, but I'm using essentially very subtle pressure on a cool gray to reference it, because the white of the eye is not white in this situation. Unless, of course, I put a light right in her eyes, but we're not going to do that. Light on the eyelid. And the one thing to be careful about with that eyelid is not to make it too light too soon. So that's why I'm gradually working up to it. So there are these little bitty cool kind of suggestions around the area where the bone's coming close to the surface, so hatching those in with the pencil. And little by little, I'll zoom in a little bit on this, you notice the eye is gradually coming in to focus. Originally it was like this. Now you can see it's a little more noticeable than this one. I'm going to take a similar approach to this side. Although, one thing I'm going to do is try to not make both eyes equally rendered. So there's a little bit of variety in the way the form relates on one side to the next. Bit of a reflection. You notice every time I'm trying to test the color, I start by just skimming it ever so slightly in that area to kind of see what the reaction's going to be, and then make a decision on whether I need to really add a lot of whatever color I'm testing. I know I've mentioned this before, but I think it's worth saying again. You notice every few seconds I constantly look back at my subject that I'm drawing, rather than going, you know, like 3, 4, 5 minutes not looking back at what I'm drawing. And I'm really carefully analyzing what I'm doing. You don't want to get in the mode when you're kind of on autopilot and you're just kind of throwing things down and not really thinking about what you're doing. So I'm sort of, you know, just hatching along the form here, like treating it like it's a sculpture, as I bring in these slightly lighter values. And one thing I would advise is don't try to rush your drawing by throwing in a bunch of color just for the sake of trying to have it look finished, or try to have it be, you know, done. I'm more concerned that you're really carefully understanding the form rather than just for the sake of, you know, the drawing having it, everything having some kind of coverage on it. Some of that red. This is one of the reasons that handout doesn't pick up all of the subtleties that are in the drawing that's over there. And another drawback of trying to work from a photograph when you are drawing is that you don't see the subtleties that you see in life. So that in mind as you're working at home. And remember that when you're dealing with the area of the mouth, especially the lips, another common problem is that everybody thinks lips, well, they should be red. The next thing you know, there's this really intense red on the mouth, and then you come in looking like you have lipstick on. So I'm glad. What's that?
My timer's going off. But
Oh, no, you can take another break. We'll just